So Kodak Gold 200, I did a video a few days ago talking about how this is such a wonderful economical alternative to more expensive films. If you haven't seen the video, I'll put a link in the description, but I really like Kodak Gold 200. And what I noticed on the test that I did is that the film has actually quite good latitude. I'll post right now, you'll see the picture that I did in the previous post. And if you take a look at it, what you can see is at ISO 200, it's phenomenal. At ISO 400, it was actually quite good, and it really worked out, nicely from a very precise standpoint out to maybe 640. 800 would be pushing it a little bit too much. So what I thought I would do today is we're going to push process this film 1 stop and 2 stops. So pushing involves increasing the development time in the C41. Now I process my own C41 E6 black and whites, everything in-house, so this would be easy for me to do. And processing your own C41 film is not hard. Just get a good thermometer. So what we're gonna do on this test scene you see here, we have this really dark foliage over here. I'm gonna place that as my deepest shadow. And then we've got the building and the sky and the area there in the wood box. This is gonna be a challenging shot, pushing gold to hold all of that tonality. Now we're gonna shoot the roll of Gold 200 that I have, and I'm gonna do 1 frame at ISO 200. So we've got like a box speed. And then I'm gonna skip the 400 because 400 was fine. And I'm gonna shoot 800, 1600, 3200, 3200, 3200. So I got 6 frames total. And what I'm gonna do is cut those ends off of the last 32 and process that as a 2-stop push. I'm curious, what happens when you push film is, generally speaking, 3 things. 1, the grain gets bigger. 2, sometimes you get a nice increase in saturation. And three, you can also get weird color shifts pushing beyond, say, 1 stop. Some films will handle 2 stops nicely. I'm curious how this film will. All right, so what we're gonna do now is we're gonna load up my linhof 617. Love this camera. I forgot how absolutely heavy this camera is. I've got a 90mm XL lens on here. Brilliant lens, should have a really 3-dimensional quality, and I'm excited to see how this looks. All right, let me first set up the scene. Yeah, that looks pretty torturous. There we go, and I got some sky in it. Yeah, it's pretty good. Okay, right about there. Okay, so we got the camera squared up. I'm gonna use a cable release, of course. And now I need to load the film. Linhof, the entire back comes off the camera on the 617. And if you want to come around here, you can see just how big a linhof 617 negative is. It's obviously 6 by 17 centimeters. Absolutely glorious camera. What I'm gonna do is load. That's good. Make sure I'm in a little bit of subdued lighting here. Come over to the side over here, Reeve. All right. Pop this in. Get the arrow lined up. Okay, let's put the back on. What's nice about this particular linhof, it's the last version. I actually have 3 lenses for this camera. This is the 90 XL, as I mentioned, but I also have a 180 and a 72, and it has a dark slide. Just a phenomenal camera to work with. I'm actually going to lower this for a minute so I can see the top. Got to reset. Wind to the first frame. All right, so we're on the first frame. In terms of depth of field and where I want to focus, I've got a small Voigtlander rangefinder on top of the camera here, and I'm actually going to move over just a couple of feet because I want to get that full tree right there. I think that's a better shot. Yeah, that's nice. Okay, and I'm going to focus on that tree, but because I'm going to be shooting like an f/32 and this is a really wide angle lens, we should have tons of depth of field. So that tree is 25, 30 feet away. So on the lens, I'm going to set it, say 25 feet. And if I stop the lens down to f32, I should have depth of field down to about 8 feet. I'm going to move that even a little more over. Let's go 20. Let's go there. So that gets me focused down to about 6.5 feet. So this should be razor sharp in the foreground. And in order to meter the scene, I'm going to use once again my Pentax digital spot meter. And my plan is to place this value here. Most people would tell you to place your shadow values at zone 3. I'm a bigger fan of placing them at zone 4. I've written a whole video on this. Zone 3 and zone system for shadow placement makes sense if you're looking at it on paper. But in terms of real world results, zone 3.5 or zone 4 is a better deep shadow placement value. But let's just see how this looks. So first I'm going to set the meter to ISO 200. I'm going to meter the dark areas, and they are dark. They are EB82. So I'm going to set 82 right about there. And the highlights on the roof are a 14. So they're like a zone 9, almost 10. The sky is more like a, I don't know, like a 12 or 13. The doors on the building there are a 12. That's like just about a 7. Inside of the box where the firewood is, that's a 9-1. So that's a real nice zone 4.5. And the lit part of the doors is like an 11-12. Yeah, I think that'll work. So this gives us f32 at half a second. So I'll go f32. There's no reciprocity at half a second, so there's no issue there. Cock the shutter, double check my focus. I'm f32. Everything's going to be sharp. All right. So double check one more time. First shot. This is at exposure index box speed 200. All right. Let's advance to the next frame. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to skip 400 because we just don't need it. So what I'm going to do now is to go from 200 to 400 or 800 is 2 stops. So I'm just going to increase my shutter speed from a half a second to an eighth of a second. I don't really want to mess with this in F numbers because I'd like to keep the focus and the depth of field the same. So I'm just going to use shutter speeds. So now the second frame is going to be at ISO or exposure index 800. Okay. Now we're going to go one more stop. So we're going to a 15th. And this now puts us at exposure index 1600. Okay. Gonna go one more stop at a 30th. And this gives us exposure index 3200. All right. I'll do another one at 3200. Oops, I'll cock the shutter. Flip it around. I normally shoot this camera handheld. It's kind of crazy. All right. And then for the last frame, because I'm just feeling like a masochist, let's do it to 6400. Let's just see what happens. So, I mean, that's just a lot. I'm going to go all the way up to a 60th. And because this is amateur grade film, I mean, technically speaking, it's not the professional grade films like the Portras. Generally speaking, amateur grade films have a pretty good exposure latitude. I'm suspicious though at 6400 and a 2-stop push, the color is going to get wonky as can be. But let's give it a shot. So one more here. And that's it for the roll. Wind it off. I like to really make sure the film is wound all the way. Open the back. Pull out the film. And I will process this film tomorrow morning. So hopefully tomorrow afternoon we'll get some scans and see just how good it looks. All right, so now we're gonna process the test rolls of film. Now if you remember, we're gonna push one set of film, one half of that film, a one stop push, and then that last little bit at the end, that extra 3200 that I did and the 6400, we're gonna push 2 stops just to see how far the Gold 200 can go. So I've got the Jobo all warmed up. I'll turn it on and let the drum warm up a little bit for a few seconds here. It's rotating in the water that is 102 degrees Fahrenheit. And like I mentioned, color processing doesn't have to be hard. Just buy yourself a good thermometer. This is a Kodak process thermometer. They were like $100. I've seen them for a lot less money now. Incredibly accurate. I've had this for 30 plus years. Just works and it's perfect every time. Get yourself a good digital thermometer, because with color, with C41 or E6, it's important specifically that the developer is within just a couple tenths of a degree, 1 or 2 degrees Celsius in terms of perfect accuracy. The more you go away from that real tight developer, the more you introduce the potential for loss of speed, increase of speed, depending if it's hot or cold, as well as problems with the overall color balance. So precision is important, but once again, it's just a simple thermometer. Okay, so what I've done now, I've set my time to compensate for that one-stop push. C41 at 102 degrees Fahrenheit is 3 minutes and 30 seconds for the developer when it's fresh chemistry right off the bat. In order to do a one-stop push, you multiply that 3.5 by 1.3, and that gives you your corrected time, which in my case, on the Sydney Still information sheet, it's kind of nice. They have a chart already doing the math for you, but that works out to 4 minutes and 55 seconds. After we do the developer, we're going to then put the film in the bleach, which is for 8 minutes. And the bleach temperature is not as important. The nice part about a rotary film processor is that I can be very accurate throughout the whole step. So first thing I'm going to do, pull out my chemistry. I know it's at temp because I just checked. I want to make sure I have at least the minimum requirement based upon my drums. Doesn't hurt to go a little bit over. I'm going to pour it in slowly to make sure that it all goes into the tank. And I hit start on my timer. Now one thing you're going to notice is on this particular test, I did on the rolls that are processing now, it's 200, 400, 800, 1600, and there should be a 32 on that end as well. And yet I'm doing a push. So in the first Gold 200 post that I did, we looked at Gold 200 and C41 and determined that it was a real solid 200, great 400, as I said, and a weak 640, 800, but definitely usable 100%, just your low shadows start dropping off. So in this case, I didn't want to do the 200 again at standard development because I already know that. What I'm curious about is how the 200 box speed looks being pushed one stop. It should be an overdevelopment. So why would I want to do that? Sometimes overdevelopment, specifically of C41 material, can be really beautiful. You'll get a little more contrast, which is not a bad thing. The highlights, I'd be curious to see how well they're held. I'm pretty sure they'll be just fine. And I'll also get an increase of saturation. So for my way of thinking, here's how I think about this. If I was a shooter that was working in bright sunny days, I could say, okay, I can do standard C41 development, and I know I'm gonna get with Gold 200, 50, 100, 200, 400. That's great. And I'll even get a usable 800 in a pinch. So that's a wonderful range. But if I'm a shooter who shoots more in low light, or if I'm a shooter who shoots a lot like an F8, F8 and B there, and I'm shooting in a lot of different type of light sources, I may wanna have a longer range, and a one-stop push might be something I always wanna do. So a one-stop push would probably give me a solid, maybe 100, 200 for sure, 400, 800, 1600, and maybe even a usable 32. Time will tell. But it depends on the style of shooting that you're doing, where you need that to go. In Portra 400, and I posted links to videos that I've done on that in the past, Portra 400, I know a whole bunch of people who do sort of urban fashion who push that film constantly to 1600 and 3200 because they like the increased color and contrast and a little more bite that the grain gets. And that's one thing that I was really impressed by with the Gold 200 was the look of the film across that range in normal development. And what I'm thinking is because it's a more traditional grain structure film, it really could be amazing with a push. But I'm just curious to see if you were using box speed, would it take it too far? Or, with that one-stop push, or is it gonna hold the highlights? That's my biggest concern, is that I'm gonna pop the highlights. But as I said before, on the last test that I did, I had highlights that were well over zone 10, 12, 13, and they were perfect in the development. So let's get the developer going, we'll do the bleach and fix, and we'll do some scans. All right, so the first set of film is drying, looks really interesting. And I've now started the next half of that roll. I've got it, once again, everything's at temp, and we're doing a 2-stop push on this one to see just how good 16 and 32 would look at a 2-stop push. So if you remember, a 1-stop push was a compensation factor of 1.3. A 2-stop push is a compensation factor of 1.75. So you take that 3.5, multiply it by 1.75. There's also, once again, a little handy cheat sheet here, and that brings it to 6 minutes and 13 seconds at 102 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's happening right now. I'll hang these up to dry when we're done, and then we're off to scan some film. All right, so here we are looking at box speed, but pushed 1 stop. And what's interesting is what happened to the color. Much like how wedding photographers a lot of times will take, say, 400 speed film and rate it at 200 or 100 to create a little bit more of a pastelish, lower contrast sort of quality by over-developing the film that one whole stop, it did the same thing. It changed the color, and I think it's absolutely beautiful. It has sort of this really sort of 1950s sort of quality to it, and I, for one, may actually do this on purpose at some time in the future because I think it looks nice. If you look to the left, of course, because it's at box speed and being pushed, we have tons of detail in the shadow of the bushes and side of the wood box there by the shed. We have tons of detail there as well. Now, in terms of scanning, it was pretty easy. I am using an Imicon 646, so I've got a really nice, huge dynamic range to work with, but it was a relatively easy scan. But I would not suggest it for more than at 200. If you were to do this at 100 and push it to stop, I think you'd have a negative that even on an Imicon or any flatbed would be very, very challenging to scan because the highlights would be completely blown. And the grain structure still seems really nice to me. I don't see excessive amounts of grain with that one-stop push, but once again, I'm kind of like blown away at how cool the color palette turned out by doing that one-stop push at box speed. Okay, so now we're looking at a one-stop push, but at exposure index 800. So 800, I think, looks really great. This is what you expect when you do a push development. It's still got really nice shadow details in the bush, really nice shadow details in the woodshed, and yet at the same time, it has an increase in contrast and an increase in saturation. It's a wild difference in color palette from what it was at the 200, and the 800 sort of went more in the direction that I would have expected. What's really interesting to note is that 400 would be somewhere in between the two, and that could actually, in my opinion, be the sweet spot. You could have 3 interesting different sort of color palettes, from more muted to a little more saturated to a lot more saturated, just by changing the development by pushing it one stop. But overall, grain, contrast, color, this works perfectly at 800. Okay, now we're looking at 1600 once again with a one-stop push. And what I see here is the shadows really are on the edge. There was not a whole lot of information left in the shadows beyond this. I didn't even bother scanning up the 3200 with one-stop push because it was just empty. Yet 1600 is usable. I do see that the shadow tones are losing a little bit of color and saturation, but at the same time, it's a pretty look. You know, you've got, good shadow detail inside of the box is still very usable, but I would say at a one-stop push, 1600 is really the edge. I would rather have you go like 1250 or 1000. I think that's a better edge, but 1600 definitely is usable at the one-stop push. And I think the color, the saturation and everything is still very, very pleasing. And just when everything was looking good, well, this is not looking so good. This was a two-stop push at 3200. And as you can see, the shadows are murky and they're really not there anymore. The color palette has gotten absolutely just ugly. And so I'm not thinking this film really goes to 3200 in color in a very meaningful way. And once again, this was the two-stop push. The one-stop push was even worse, and the 64 was absolutely terrible. There was really nothing there outside of the highlight. So note on this one is that if you're going to push it to 32, your color is going to start getting kind of this wonky, sort of not very pleasing, and your shadows are falling very quickly. Again, this was scanned on an Imicon 646, and I'm able to bring those shadows up as much as I did, but they're still not great looking. However, there is a solution that you can do for a shot like this, and I'll show it to you right now. You could always convert it into a black and white, and somehow miraculously it feels better. The color is what was really throwing my eye off. And you could also do that for the 1600 as well. You could do it for any of them, but at 3200, if you had to shoot it at that speed just because of the available light, you could convert it to black and white and get what actually is a relatively nice looking scene. The shadows are definitely crushed and they're breaking up a little bit, but absolutely 100% usable. All right, so in conclusion, Gold 200. We know I already love the film at standard box speed, standard C41 development. In the first video, once again, really solid from say 50, 100 out to say 640. If I want to push the film, I got sort of three ways to think about that. Method one would be if I wanted just a little more speed for say 800 or 1600 and to have those be really solid. A one-stop push would absolutely nail that, and I love the color and I love the saturation. So that's one reason to do it. The second reason would be is if I want that sort of interesting color palette that I got at the 200 with the one-stop push. My suspicion is that 400 would also still be holding on to some of that particular color palette, and I think it's really beautiful, and I could see where an artist, may want to use the material for that particular look. And the third thing is a two-stop push. 3200, 1600, you're not going to get 64, but 32 would be really on the edge. And at that point, either I'm for some reason liking the color palette, or I'm going to 100% convert it into black and white, and it is usable in that situation. So if you find yourself out shooting and you've got only Gold 200 in your bag, it is a solution. One last thought is, how would I compare pushing Gold 200 to pushing Portra 400? There's really no comparison. Portra 400 just pushes beautifully. I mean, absolutely beautifully. 1600, 3200, no problem. Color palette doesn't get crazy. Beautiful shadows, highlight control. It's just a push monster. So if I was going to a location where I knew I was going to push everything, I would probably spend the extra money and buy Portra 400. But as I'm always on a budget, like most photographers I know, I would seriously consider the Gold 200 before I made that investment based upon the results that I just showed in the video. Thank you very much for listening. I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Now go shoot some film.